which is my name.
All right, let's get started. Oh, sorry.
All right, let's do it. No, go for it.
All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Zooming Through Summer. Today, we are talking with Adam, who is a fourth-year med student. And if you guys have any questions or comments, please leave them in the chat, the public chat. But please keep the comments and questions relevant to the conversation, because sometimes people do leave comments that are a bit distracting and can take away from the conversations. Remember to mute yourselves. I have the settings set, but sometimes it just doesn't. And we'll let Adam get started. Could you just introduce yourself?
Yeah, what's going on, everyone? My name's Adam Nessim. I'm a fourth-year medical student in New York. I go to Albert Einstein College of Medicine, which is actually in the Bronx. I'm actually on a gap year right now. So some medical students between your third and fourth year medical school will take a research year. So that's what I'm doing right now. I also do a ton of pre-med advising, been doing it for, 5+ years. I started as an MCAT instructor for one of the major test prep companies, and then left to start my own company, the Pre-Med Consultants, where basically our goal is to have a program that helps you throughout the entire pre-med process, from freshman all the way through getting into medical school. So I do a lot of that now, and I noticed some people in the chat have seen me on TikTok. So I make some TikToks that are geared towards helping you guys with productivity as a student, learning good study strategies, knowing about how to become a doctor, what the pre-med process is like. And also, if you're interested in other areas of healthcare like PA, dental, I touch upon that a little bit as well.
Mm-hmm. All right. So can you just get us started off by telling us a little bit about your undergrad journey and how it led you to choose an MD school?
Yeah, sure. So I went to Cornell in Ithaca, loved my experience there. Had a lot more fun than I thought I even would have as a pre-med student at Cornell, which you can do if you get your study strategies down early on. So I would say going into college, I was already like going in as a pre-med student. I know some people figured that out later on. So I did my senior year of high school, a program at Johns Hopkins where you were there for a week and you kind of acted as a medical student. So you went into classes, you did like patient interaction stuff. And so I kind of want to know, like, have some experience whether going in before I'm declaring pre-med at Cornell, which is not that easy. So I did that my senior year, started at Cornell, and made sure to first see if I could handle the workload. I think that you shouldn't, if you really want to be a doctor, let that discourage you. Even if you're struggling early on, you can improve as a student. And I learned a lot about how to study, and high school for a lot of students, I feel like isn't too bad. And then you get to college and it's a whole nother ball game. So I, while also figuring out if I can manage classes, I was continuously trying to get experience in the healthcare field. And you should be doing that throughout the entire process. So whether that's shadowing doctors, getting clinical experience, being in a pre-med program, going to things like this. Right now everything's virtual. So something like this is very helpful. And just constantly trying to get more and more exposure while also making sure I'm doing all the stereotypical pre-med things that you need to do to have a good application. And so I thoroughly enjoyed my experience at Cornell, and everything I did, whether that was shadowing over the summer, I think it was my sophomore year summer, I did like an 8-week intensive program, shadowing in various different departments. And after that experience, that's when I really knew, like, all right, I've been able to manage the coursework. And even if I didn't, I would have figured it out, because at that point I knew this is the career path for me. And so I made sure that there was really no plan B. That's what I was going to do.
Mm-hmm. So was there a specific reason why you chose an MD school over DO, or was it just something that, you kind of went with?
So I don't know if everyone here knows, in the chat, does everyone know the difference between MD and DO schools? So there's osteopathic and allopathic medical schools. Honestly, what I say to students is both are great options. The difference with osteopathic medical schools is you have an extra course that's called OMM. You do like osteopathic manipulations and you learn it. Those schools they do tend to be easier in regards to grades of getting into them. So whether that's like GPA and MCAT scores, but other than that, especially now, a lot of the residencies are combined. It really makes no difference. I personally had the scores to go to an MD school. And even if you think you don't, you should still apply to both. I highly recommend. So I didn't really focus in on osteopathic medical schools too much. I also knew I potentially wanted to do a very competitive specialty of orthopedics. And I would say the only drawback to osteopathic is sometimes for those really, really competitive specialties, it's a little bit harder to match. Other than that, you can be an amazing physician out of osteopathic medical schools. I just personally knew that I had the grades where I wasn't too worried about getting in, although you never know. Now these days I advise students to really just apply to both. But there was no like specific reason I was like, oh, I'm definitely not doing osteopathic, or I definitely want to do MD. Either way, you're going to be a doctor and you could be an amazing doctor. So I think if you're thinking about applying to both, like definitely do so. It's just going to increase your chances.
Mm-hmm. So going back to the application process, in terms of, you already have your grades and you already talked about that a little bit, but in terms of extracurriculars, as a undergrad right now, what would you suggest in terms of like volunteering and shadowing, and how would a student get involved in things like this?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the first thing I tell students for the freshmen and sophomores here is you don't want to overload yourself with extracurriculars too much. Still, it's going to be your academics that's the most important when you're applying. So that's going to be your GPA and MCAT score. Extracurriculars are great, but you have to get down the studying for hard science courses in college first. So I recommend easing into taking on. So for me, I took on one new extracurricular every semester for the first like 2 years. So my first semester, I joined club soccer, and that was strictly because I love soccer. I played like varsity in high school and wanted to continue with that. It had nothing to do with pre-med, and that's actually important. You should be doing things that you truly enjoy, not trying to choose every extracurricular just because you think it's going to look good for a medical school apps. The second semester, I joined a fraternity. So if you notice at this point, I finished my whole freshman year and nothing I did was like pre-med related. Then I started to get involved in research, and then I joined like pre-med fraternity or club, Phi DE. I don't know if anyone in here is in Phi DE or knows of it, but that was very helpful because there was a group of pre-med students. There was mentorship. We did a lot of philanthropy, stuff like that. And then you have my advice there is ease into extracurriculars because you need to make sure your academics, you have enough time to do well academically. Mm-hmm. In terms of shadowing clinical experience, that's very important. So a lot of students confuse this. There's shadowing and there's clinical experience. Shadowing is going to be when you're following a doctor around, seeing exactly what they do, and you're really understanding what the day-to-day of a doctor's life is like. Whereas clinical experience is going to be actually interacting with patients. So that could be you're an EMT, you are a phlebotomist, you're a volunteer in a hospital and you take vitals, or you're a medical assistant, stuff like that. So I definitely recommend getting those at some point. The earlier you can do that, the better. And it doesn't have to be super intense with like how many hours you're working right away, but you should have some sort of consistency, whether it's clinical or shadowing experience. So it's not just, oh, I shadowed this doctor for 1 week and that was it.
Mm-hmm. So when going back to more of like getting a job in a clinical setting, you said phlebotomist and other things. How would you recommend going about getting a job like this? And are there certifications? Like what type of things are for a job like that?
So you got it. Yeah, you have to get the certifications for whatever it is. So if it's EMT, you're going to be taking an EMT course. Phlebotomy has their own course. Yes, I see someone asked as being a CNA count. So that'll definitely count for clinical experience. But remember, even if you have a ton of clinical experience, you need to have shadowing as well. So yeah, you have to go through whatever certification course you need. A lot of them you could find online now. And then the key is just being persistent. Like if you apply for one job and don't get it, that's okay. You should be really reaching out, applying for multiple positions, and really being persistent with going after that clinical experience or shadowing or whatever it is. But again, don't ever do it at the expense of your grades. That has to still be like your primary focus. And then you start to layer these other extracurriculars on. Because what I see a lot is students are working almost 40 hours a week in their clinical experience position and their grades are slipping. And that's going to hurt you a lot more than having a little less hours clinically, but doing better grades wise.
Right. So along with all your extracurriculars and your clinical hours and shadowing, how do you recommend getting letters of recommendation and how do you ask for them?
Good question. So for letters of rec, you don't want to just ask a professor that really doesn't know you. If let's say it's a big orgo class and you did relatively well, so you think you're going to get a letter of rec from them, that's like a last resort type situation. I would really start thinking about forming relationships with professors so that they get to know you on a personal level. And the best way to do that is you could start honestly just by emailing them, asking them a question, maybe about their course, go to their office hours. Office hours is by far the easiest way to get to know a professor. And then also sometimes it's easier in the smaller classes, but like I said, professors usually should, even for the bigger classes, host their own office hours. So starting to go to those, get to know your professor, and it doesn't have to be, if you don't hit it off with them, that's okay. Maybe that's not the one you ask for a letter of rec. When you do ask for a letter of rec, you want to make it as easy as possible for them, especially after they agree. One thing I like to do, or I recommend to students, if they're on the fence about, sometimes if you've hit it off with someone, they're going to write you a great letter. If you're not sure, you might want to say something like, hey, I've really enjoyed my time in your class and you've been very helpful. I was wondering, would you be willing to write me a strong letter of recommendation for medical school? And adding the word strong in there kind of backs that person into a corner in a way. It's like a little trick, because if they don't feel like they're going to actually write you a good one, then that gives them the out to be like, I don't think I would be comfortable doing that. And honestly, getting a no from someone rather than them saying yes and writing you a bad letter you're going to be much better off. So it's okay to get a no from someone writing you a letter of rec. The worst case, and this happens to students, especially students that don't have any clue sometimes why they got rejected from medical school, is because they have a poor letter of recommendation, sometimes even speaking negatively of that student, which is terrible. I don't think professors should write the letter of rec if they're going to speak negatively, but it does happen. So kind of positioning yourself like that, I'd say, is one thing you could do. These days, it has to be done online for the most part. So you could ask maybe to do like a virtual coffee meeting with the professor, ask them there. Or if you really can't and you need to write an email, then it could be done by email. But I wouldn't just cold email a professor you haven't spoken to in over a year. So you kind of have to feel it out based on the relationship.
Mm-hmm. So going off of relationships with professors, in terms of research, would you recommend it? And if you do recommend it, would you recommend getting research opportunities from professors you know better?
So I would say I definitely, if you're looking to go to medical school, recommend at least trying research for a semester. You don't have to have research to get into medical school, although if we're talking about some of the top research focused medical schools, you kind of do. Like if you look at, I don't know the stats by heart or memory, but it's like Harvard or so, it's going to be like 80 to 90% of that class has some sort of research experience. That could be completely wrong, but I know like some of those top research institutions, it's a very, very large majority. So there's really no excuse for not at least trying. What I recommend is, it could be with a professor you have a good relationship with, but also doing research in a topic you actually enjoy. You do not have to do wet lab, bench research where you're micropipetting and stuff like that. I did research in nutrition sciences and really enjoyed that. So it could be clinical. If you're near a hospital, that's even better. I wasn't really near a hospital where there was research, but it could be psych research. Whatever you enjoy, that's what I recommend doing research in. A lot of students kind of get scared away from research because they just envision the classic, you're in a lab coat, you're like grinding it out, pipetting all day. And you might love that. I'm not bashing on that, but I know a lot of students don't. And so don't feel like it has to be that type of research.
Mm-hmm. So going with all your research, your grades, everything, how do you suggest we write out our personal statements, and do you have any tips for that?
Sure. So personal statements, the goal of the personal statement for medical school is to show the admissions committees why you want to be a physician. It's not to sell yourself on why you're going to be the best physician ever. This is a mistake I see when I'm reading students' personal statements a lot, is it comes off slightly cocky, to be honest. It's hard. It's hard to write about yourself like where you're trying to show how amazing you are, but also not come off in that manner. So the best way is to just show why specifically you want to be a physician. What experiences have you had that have allowed you to come to that decision? And then through anecdotes, you could start to show different characteristics of yourself. You really want to show and not tell. If you say, I am extremely hardworking and I'm a team player and I'm compassionate, that's amazing. But I've read 7 students in a row's essays that all said that. Why would I trust that that's the case? Show me a story and then let me come to the conclusion of that. So that's what you want to be thinking about with the personal statements. Another thing I see with personal statements a lot is students will write a lot about like medical stuff and clinical experience, but not distinguish why. This is specifically for if it's a medical school personal statement, specifically why doctor over other professions. Because if you talk about wanting to help people and liking to interact with patients, there are a lot of other professions in healthcare that do that. So you have to kind of, by the end of that personal statement, show why specifically physician amongst anything else. Mm-hmm. So those are some things I'd be thinking about.
Right. So along with that, can we get a little bit more into the MCAT and talk about that? So what are the techniques that you would suggest for studying for the MCAT, and when should students get started?
So, in full transparency, I have my own MCAT program, but I would say, and these are the same techniques that top medical students use, you want a combination of anything that's active studying rather than passive. So that's going to be usually a question-based approach. So I recommend doing questions from the very beginning. This is something a lot of students don't do when preparing for the MCAT. The very classic thing pre-meds will do is you'll spend the summer reading through all the textbooks of, let's say, one of those test prep companies, and they'll highlight it, they'll write notes until their hand cramps. Then by the end of the summer, they've forgotten 95% of everything they just studied. And then they start taking like a course and then are in long lectures. And then a month out, they start really doing practice questions, practice tests. And that's where they see their biggest score improvements, because that's the most effective studying, especially when it comes to the MCAT, which is not just content, but being able to understand how to read a passage, apply what you read with your outside knowledge. So you want to be doing that from the very beginning. I recommend generally about 6 months of studying for the MCAT if you're really looking for a top score. It also depends on, like, you can do it in 3. It also depends on, are you doing other things? Like, are you in a semester of classes, or do you have nothing to do but study for the MCAT? So if you have the entire summer to just study for the MCAT, you can do it in 3. But a lot of students are doing it while in semester. So questions, extremely important. The next thing is going to be spaced repetition. So basically, spaced repetition is you're reviewing that material over and over again within spaced intervals. I don't know, does anyone here know what Anki is? Anki flashcards? I see a lot of yeses. Okay, great. Yeah, that's what most med students use to study for their boards. That's what I highly recommend to use overlay Quizlet for the MCAT. The reason being is it incorporates spaced repetition for you. So it knows when do you need to see that card next, because you're probably going to forget it in 6 days. So it's going to show it to you in 5 days. So you get that refresh. And you just keep doing that over and over again. So I have my students use UWorld, the question bank, as well as Anki flashcards in combination throughout their entire prep. And so you're getting that real life practice. Then any content that you're forgetting, you're putting that into a flashcard, so you're never forgetting it. As opposed to if you just strictly go through textbooks or lectures, you might, let's say, a biochem lecture in the first week of studying, and then you haven't reviewed that material for 5-6 weeks at a time, you're going to forget it by that time. So using this approach, if you're already studying for the MCAT, I highly recommend at least starting to incorporate some of those things, and you'll see major improvements over the course of a couple of weeks.
So going on from that, let's say with all of this, a student either doesn't get into med school or they feel like they need more time to prepare. Would you recommend a gap year, and what would you suggest a student do during a gap year?
Before I answer, I see someone looking at buying Anki already. It's free on the computer, so you don't have to buy it just yet. If you want to have the app as well, then yeah, it's like $25 on the App Store. So gap years, I highly recommend to most pre-meds, especially now with the new MCAT having biochem and psych and soc. It's harder to get your prereqs in all by, let's say, because you'd have to take the MCAT usually January or April of your junior year. And especially if you didn't start off taking bio and chem 1 in your first semester, you're usually a little bit behind. I think the gap year is really good for most pre-meds. Now it's the majority of pre-meds that will take the gap year, and it allows you to focus in on, 1, not rushing your application, and 2, let's say you needed to get more clinical experience, research, shadowing, whatever it is, you can take that time to do it during that year. So I recommend it for most students. If you're doing great and you're getting, A minuses, A's from freshman year on, then you might be in the case where you don't really need that gap year. But I've worked with hundreds, if not thousands of students, and I don't think one time has anyone ever said, I regretted taking the gap year.
Mm-hmm. So, what would you say the best thing a student could do in undergrad to really stand out on the application process?
So there's not going to be one specific thing. You have to kind of craft your story.
Mm-hmm.
So when the admissions committees are talking about students, right, maybe they're looking for if you're going to get an interview, or it's already the students that interviewed and now they're talking about them. You want to be known as something. This was the entrepreneur student. This was the dancer student. Because you're not going to be known as the pre-med student, because everyone is a pre-med student, right? So you want to craft some sort of story that makes sense and that's consistent. And that's a good way to stand out. Besides obviously getting the good grades, MCAT scores, doing extracurriculars, you just want to have your own narrative. Sometimes that could be in the personal statement. Other times, if you don't think you have the most unique personal statement story, that's okay. There will be some passion, some interest that you do that can make you stand out. And that's why doing things outside of pre-med is important as well.
Mm-hmm. So overall, so to someone who might be confused on if medicine is really for them, what would you say the most important qualities an aspiring physician should have? Like, what should a person look for in themselves to see if medicine is for them?
So I guess I'll approach this with two things. In terms of being a good physician, you really want to be empathetic towards your patients. You need to be able to put them above yourself sometimes. And that's going to require, hard hours when you're in residency, a lot of hard work studying pre-med, med school. So you need to really know that you want it and be driven towards that goal. So yeah, that's what I would say. Being a good physician, the patient's got to come first. And so empathy towards your patients, and knowing that, and it's just because, even if you have empathy, let's say towards patients, doesn't mean you need to be a physician. That's why also shadowing is very important to see. Maybe you like the lifestyle of a PA better, or maybe the responsibilities of a nurse is something that you're attracted to. Like everything in healthcare has a role. And so it doesn't have to be physician, but it's important to look into, and that's why shadowing is so important, look into the various different roles and positions you can have within healthcare before, making that decision of going down the long journey of pre-med, med school, residency, and then one day attending.
Mm-hmm. And just sort of going back to your major a little bit, I see a lot of people are asking.
I do see a lot, yeah.
Sorry.
What was the question?
I was gonna say, if you could talk about that and maybe go over the pros and cons of having a non-hard science major as a pre-med.
Sure. So my major was called Human Biology, Health, and Society. Don't ask me why Cornell gave it such a fancy name. I don't know. It was basically like a bio and nutrition major. And then I also had the opportunity to take a lot of cool electives. So I concentrated in health policy. So I took a lot of health policy classes. So I know like the US health system, other health systems, how the pharmaceutical industry works, stuff like that. So I really enjoyed that. It allowed me to get all my pre-med recs in and take some cool classes. In regards to choosing your major, it doesn't really matter that much. And when I say that, I mean, you can be pre-med out of any major. You don't have to be bio or chem or the classic hard sciences. But when you do pick something else, let's say you pick music, which is, let's say, one way to stand out, you will have to be aware that you're going to have to get those pre-med recs in, and it's going to add to your schedule and your workload. So you may be taking more credits per semester. You may have some more organization to do with making sure you're getting everything in time. And so if you're really passionate about something else, let's say whether it's business, music, whatever, I think definitely go for it as a major. It'll make you stand out in some ways, but it has the drawbacks of you have to be very on top of your stuff to make sure you're getting all the prereqs in and whatnot.
Mm-hmm. So before we move into more of your current life and what you're doing now, I thought we could go over some of the questions that students have regarding undergrad. And a big one I saw was, do you think there's an advantage going to a less competitive school or a smaller school in order to form better connections with your professors?
I think it depends on the student themselves. Like I said, you technically can Cornell had pretty big classes, and I was still able to form not as big as, let's say, something like Michigan, but I was still able to perform or make connections with my professors because I went to office hours, I emailed them, etc. If you feel like a smaller setting for you is good for you, then definitely go for it. The less competitive thing is interesting. It will make, like, you really do want to do well wherever you are. So a lot of students are concerned about going to, let's say, a less competitive school, even starting at a community college, because they think it'll look bad. But if you're crushing your classes there, if you're getting A's, that's still going to look really good. Admissions committees can't say, oh, like, he should have done more, or she should have done more, because you're still getting A's. And then the MCAT is, I guess you could say, some people like to say the great equalizer. That's probably up for debate. But you can absolutely do well going to one of those schools. So if you're going to get a near 4.0 at a less competitive school versus getting a 2.9 at Cornell, that near 4.0 at the less competitive school is definitely going to look better.
Mm-hmm. So another question I saw for you specifically was, why did you choose to be a doctor over a PA or a nurse? So why did you choose med school?
Good question. That's like I'm at a med school interview. So for me, I knew that I wanted to be able to practice at the top of my license. I knew that I wanted the responsibility of, when it comes down to it, the doctor is going to be making the final call, especially if it's an emergency situation. Everyone's looking to the physician of what to do, and they have to take responsibility if something goes poorly as well. And I knew that I wanted to take that role on. And also I wanted to have the most, I guess, in-depth knowledge that I could on various disease states, because I will say, amongst all the professions, and they're all great, you do have the most training when it comes to being a doctor. That's why you have the 4 years of medical school, then 3 to 7 years of residency. So you really have very intense training. And I knew that's something that I wanted to go through so that I could provide the best care to patients. And so that's kind of, for me, what sold it. But with that said, there's so many other professions that are so valuable and have their role. Like, I couldn't do some of the things that the nurses do. And so you'll see when you start getting into the hospital and working, you'll see how it all the puzzle pieces fit together.
Mm-hmm. And just to wrap up the undergrad portion a little bit, do you have any words of advice for undergrad students before we move on into more of your med school experience?
I would say really learn how to learn. So most students never really put any thought into it. They just do whatever studying tactics they think work for them, and are stressed most of the time, pulling all-nighters. You don't have to do that. You can do pre-med, have a good time, do well. It is possible, I promise. The key to that is, if you're not getting good grades, you should reevaluate, like, what study strategies are you using? Are they effective? Are you just rewriting all your notes? If so, maybe that's not working for you. Even though it feels good, it feels like you're being productive. Why don't you try starting early with your studying, using spaced repetition early on? So if it's an anatomy and physiology class you're taking, start making those Anki cards early, keep up with them every day. And you'll find that if you start doing this properly, you'll have more time to go out, hang with friends, do whatever. I know COVID right now, there's not as much time for that, or not as much time, but you shouldn't be doing that. But it is possible. And so really, when you learn how to study well, I think a lot of things can change for you. And then also just being willing to put in the work. Like, make sure you know this is what you want, because it's hard to be motivated when you don't feel like it's something you actually want. So you got to be doing it for you, not for anyone else.
Mm-hmm. So moving more into your current life and what you're doing now, how did you pick your med school, and what are some things students should take into consideration when deciding on which med schools to apply to?
Sure. So, I mean, I would say, first off, location is important, but you should be willing to move. You're probably more likely to get into your state schools, to be honest, but definitely apply broadly, but don't apply anywhere that you're not willing to go. You should only apply places you're actually willing to go. For me, most of my interviews and stuff came from New York schools, because I'm from New York. I went to college in New York. And so a lot of times they'll see that and they know you're staying. So I know a lot of Cali people end up staying in Cali, but definitely apply broadly. For me, with choosing schools, I wanted to see something that, like, the mission fit. The Bronx, where I'm in medical school at Einstein, it's a very diverse population. So not only are you really being able to make a difference, you're getting really good training, because a lot of times you're hands-on in places where other medical schools may not not be as hands-on with patients. And so that was really cool for me. There's very much a give back philosophy at our school. Like all the first year students, second year students help in the free clinic. So these are some of the things that I thought were great about my school. I also like the atmosphere when I actually went. And I was lucky enough to have no pre-meds at that school, or well, they were med students at that time, but so I got to really speak to them. And that's the best way to get a feel for, I think, the environment at that medical school, is to speak to students that are there. Like the admissions tours are great, but you know, they're all planned out and everything. So speak to actual students. Also, pass fail is pretty nice in med school. So a lot of med schools, the first 2 years are pass fail, which is probably very different from anything you've seen in undergrad, which does have its perks. Yes, the USMLE is also, the step one is going pass fail. It definitely has its perks. It takes a lot of the pressure off of, let's say, having to feel like you have to be the top of the top all the time. And let's be honest, some people are like, oh, well, won't that de-incentivize students to study? All medical students, for the most part, are type A. Like, no one's going to not be studying. But, you know, things happen. Like, for example, I tore my ACL the day before my GI final, and I was up really late and then had to wake up early to take the final. And I was just like, you know what? I know this is not going well, but I'm comfortable enough that I'm going to pass this test. And sure enough, it was like the worst test I had in medical school, but I passed it and it didn't matter at all. So that's nice. So if that's like an extra thing, if you're debating between two schools, something to consider, but not obviously the most important factor.
So if it is pass fail for all your exams and the USMLE is also pass fail, how would you go about getting into a more competitive residency?
So third year is not going to be pass fail. So in your rotations, you're going to get graded. And also they're only making step one pass fail. Now step two is just going to be the more weighted test, because that's going to be the score. So between your third year clerkships, your step two score and letters of recommendation, and then the things you do outside and like the application, you still have tons of grades and scores. But for the first 2 years, it's nice that you don't have to always worry about it.
Okay. I do see a lot of people asking about your opinion on Caribbean medical schools. So could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So this is always a controversial topic. So I'll probably take some heat for when I say this, but my recommendation is not to go to Caribbean schools, at least if without applying to MD, DO schools, I'd say 2 cycles. And maybe 1 cycle you don't get in, reevaluate and make changes to your app. Don't just reapply, like figure out what went wrong and see how you can make changes and then apply again. The problem with Caribbean schools is a lot of times, one, there's a lot of weed out. So they're not pass fail, that's for sure. You have to be doing really well, and it's a pretty competitive environment because it's harder to match back into a residency in the US. So there, it's a lot more important to be at the top of your class. Also, it could be very, very expensive, more so than the schools in the US. And there are stories of students getting into $200,000-$300,000 of debt, not matching, and now you have no way of paying that back. And so that's the risk that comes with going to Caribbean schools. With that said, you can absolutely be a great doctor if you go to a Caribbean school. I know great doctors from Caribbean schools. It's just not something I would be considering right off the bat if you can go the normal MD-DO route.
Mm-hmm. Okay, moving more into your life currently, could you tell us what it's like to be a medical student, like between your 3rd and 4th year, and talk maybe more about your gap year?
Sure. So, and just talking about like my overall medical school experience, I've loved it so far. People say you give up your 20s to go to med school. I don't agree with that. I think you can have fun. You just have to be able to again, it always goes back to, if you know how to study properly, your entire life does not have to be studying, and nor it should be, because that will lead to burnout. And so I've had a lot of fun during medical school. Yes, there's definitely comes in cycles. There will be times where you're grinding really hard, and then there'll be times when it's a little bit more laid back. So those were the first 2 years. Then you take step one. Then I did 3rd year rotations. So that was cool, because now you're actually essentially taking on clinical duties, and you are, I'm doing an OB/GYN rotation. I delivered a baby. I'm in surgeries, and I'm, putting in a suture or whatever it is. So that's pretty cool. Now I'm in my gap year, which not every most students don't do a gap year in medical school. but it's becoming more and more common, especially if you want to go into a competitive specialty. I'm not positive I'm going to apply orthopedics, but at the time I was doing orthopedics research, and I wanted to take the year to continue doing more in-depth research. I also planned on traveling a little bit, but that kind of went out the window with COVID. And then I also work on my company, the pre-med consultant. So all that combined kind of led to my decision to take the gap year. And also I, unlike most people, went straight through to medical school. So for me, it just made sense. And so that's what I've been doing during this year.
Mm-hmm. So, going from your movement or your transition from undergrad to grad, how much time do you spend studying per week, and how much more of a learning curve was it for you?
So I wouldn't say I honestly, like, Cornell pre-med's no walk in the park. So, and pre-med in general is no walk in the park. So I was studying really hard there and in medical school. The difference that I think in medical school is the amount of information you get exposed to right off the bat is so much more than undergrad. You go at a much more rapid pace. Like the phrase people like to use is like, it's trying to drink water out of a fire hose. And so you need to really have good studying down. And that's why, like, Anki for medical students, like at almost every, I shouldn't say almost everyone, but it's a very big thing, because that is the way to memorize the ridiculous amount of information that is required in medical school. So that was, like, I'd say a learning curve when it comes to that. But other than that, I wouldn't say I feel like I study so much harder in med school than I did in undergrad. And sometimes I feel like I studied less. But then sometimes it's more, because, like, for example, when you're in third year and you're doing clinical experience and you're in the hospital from 6 a.m. to 7 p.m., then you have to get home, maybe work out or eat dinner, and then you have to study for your shelf exam. That's when it gets pretty difficult. So like I said, it goes in waves depending on where you're at in the process.
Mm-hmm. So can you talk more about your gap year and more about the pre-med consultant and how this could help pre-meds, and what kind of sparked your interest in creating this?
Yeah, sure. So I used to teach for one of the big test prep companies. I'm sure you all know it or have the books from them. It was a great experience. I taught the classes. I did a lot of online coaching and whatnot, but I felt then like something was missing when it comes to those types of, like, private programs. A lot of times it was like the students come in, they come out, and that's it. And I really enjoyed the, like, long-term mentorship with students. Some of them would, email me, tell me their scores, maybe ask me a few questions about the admissions process. But if they wanted, like, admissions stuff, they would have to pay for a whole nother package, etc. So when I started medical schools, when I left that company, and I decided I was going to make a program that essentially helps students throughout the entire process. So once you're part of the program, even if you join, let's say, freshman year, you're going to get help with your classes, learning these proper study tactics that I've talked about a little bit here, and we go more in depth into that. When it comes time for the MCAT, we have a full MCAT program, and we also use the same methods I talk about that top medical students are using. We're using question-based approach, active studying, and spaced repetition, all incorporated into that program from the beginning. And then we also have help with admission. So that's personal statement, interview prep, all of that. So and we have, like, weekly office hours to help students. We have coaches that are constantly making sure that holding students accountable. A lot of it's about holding you guys accountable. And we have an awesome group that helps each other out. So that's been over the last 3 years, and it's been very rewarding. And so that's, like, a passion of mine. I love, giving back to students. And I also wanted to create something that I felt helped with everything. So there wasn't like you had to keep going and getting different stuff. This is like, whatever you need, we're going to help you with.
Mm-hmm. So in all of this, like, doing med school, running the pre-med consultants, doing all this, how do you allocate time for leisure? Because, like, I'm stressed out just listening to you talk about this.
You learn here. I'm going to put the link. So let's see. Here's a link to more details on the program. And then you could actually book a call it'll be either me or one of the coaches to see if it would be a good fit. There's, like, a short little application as well. But so in terms of managing things, it comes in. So people, like, freak out about doing so many things at once. I don't, let's say, go super hard for my business at the same time going super hard for research while studying for the boards. Yes, I do that all, but it's all about I don't really believe in multitasking. If you look at the literature on multitasking, it's actually a lot less effective. So when I do something, I try to focus on one thing at a time. And by doing that, I'm able to be more effective and efficient with that. And then I move on to the next thing. And also, this is something that I'm really passionate about, like the pre-med advising and the company and business and stuff like that is my outlet. Like when some people, hang out, watch Netflix, whatever, that's like what I enjoy to do. So that's kind of how I've been able to do all of it at once. But I still have time to like see friends, hang out. Again, it comes in waves. If there's a test I have to study for in medical school, you're not going to see me for the next week or so. But then the test is over and, we're just starting a new unit. I'm able to go out in Manhattan or whatever it is. So you have to like be willing to, I guess, lock down and study when you need to, and then you can enjoy yourself when you have the time. So it's all about balance.
Mm-hmm. So I know you said it's not typical for students to take a gap year during med school. Do you think it'll be difficult for you to pick up where you left off? And could you talk about maybe the pros and cons of that?
Say that one more time. Sorry.
Do you think it would be difficult for you to pick up where you left off for a student who might be considering a gap year in med school? Do you think it'll be hard for you to just pick up where you left off?
Like you're saying in terms of studying and whatnot and getting back into it?
Yeah.
Not really. You'll get back into it really quick. The second medical school hits, like you're going to be, especially just one gap year. That's not like for students that are out 5-6 years, it's harder to get back into the swing of things. But even those students are doing post-bac programs and then studying for the MCAT. So the 1 year really is not going to set you back. Within the first 3 weeks, you'll feel like a student again. Some students, it takes longer to adjust, but if you do have a gap year or more, some schools, like I know mine has a program where the first couple of weeks you can come early and start taking like classes that are like pass fail, or they're actually not even like on your transcript. They're just like kind of like refresher classes to get you into the swing of things. So I wouldn't be too worried about that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So what are some of the most important things to know before starting med school?
Good question. I keep deferring back, but knowing how to study properly is really, really important. If you can do that, it just frees up so much time and stress for yourself. Also know that you're not just a medical student. You have a life outside of medical school and you don't have to have your entire identity wrapped up in that. So for me, like having this business was actually so helpful for balance because I didn't feel like the only thing I did is medical school. I would also do, and like I would play sports. I would hang out with friends. Like that is so, so important. You need to remember that going into medical school because sometimes it can feel like that's all you're doing. And that's where the mental health and the burnout starts to come in.
Mm-hmm. So can you talk about what you enjoy about med school and what do you enjoy the least or what do you hate about it?
I would say I enjoyed a lot of stuff. So learning actual medicine as opposed to orgo was really fun. Unless we have some people here, I'm sure that love orgo, but like you really start to learn things that that's going to allow you to help a patient one day. And so that's probably the coolest part, especially when you just start out in medical school. And then even better is actually going and seeing patients, treating, like you're obviously not, when you treat a patient, like it's always under the supervision of a doctor, but you're actually hands-on with patients by your third year or sometimes even sooner, depending on the medical school. And that's probably been the most fun experience. I would say what I don't like, I'd say sometimes the classes that you're taking, some of them feel a little dragged out and unnecessary, depending on the class. Let me think. I mean, sometimes it can be extremely stressful, like especially having the pressure of, the boards. When I took step one, it wasn't pass fail. And it always feels very high stakes. And so, that's something that you have to manage, but I think everyone who's pre-med kind of understands that, but it always continuously is getting harder and harder. So that's something that, I would say isn't the best, but it's something that comes with the journey.
Mm-hmm. So before we move on into questions, how do you deal with burnout?
For me, it's having other things that I enjoy doing and doing those. Like you have to do things you like doing outside of medicine. Otherwise, I think you will burn out. So for me, that's working on my business it's playing pickup basketball or soccer when I'm not recovering from a torn ACL. And yeah, so for me, I think that's important for burnout. If you're really struggling, like it's okay. Like there's a lot of medical students that struggle with mental health. Physicians have like one of the highest suicide rates out of any profession. And so that's like a dark reality that people don't talk about a lot, but it's okay to seek help, medical help, whether that's go see a psychiatrist, reaching out to someone. This is like a common thing that people feel. So I would really make sure that you're focusing on your mental health first, because you're not going to be able to, go through the process, be there for patients and whatnot if you can't be there for yourself first. So that's something really important. And I would definitely focus in, if you're struggling, like reach out to someone, whether that's a family member, someone you trust, or like a professional.
So going into some of these questions that I'm seeing from people, how would you explain a no credit /W on a transcript, or maybe even low grades in your personal statement or on your applications? How do you go about dealing with that?
So this is a tricky one, and it a lot of times has to be personalized to depending on your situation. So it's hard for me to give very general advice. What I would say is, if it's something small, like you had to withdraw your freshman year on some course, you don't even have to bring too much attention to it. Like you really don't. Especially, let's say you have a withdrawal during COVID. Most admissions committees are going to know that stuff during COVID was weird, and maybe you had to pass fail because that's what the school required or whatever it is. So if it's something minor, I honestly wouldn't even draw too much attention to it. You do get the opportunity to explain, let's say, a bad grade or something like that. I would only do that if there's really something that's going to be a good explanation. So let's say you were sick, or there was a death in the family, or something really happened where it seems out of context with the rest of your app. You're doing mostly good, great, you have great grades, but you have a 1D in something for some reason. That's where you would explain it. Other than that, like if you have straight D's and C's, it's going to be hard to be like, oh, I just, like it's going to sound like a lot of excuses. So the best way to counter that, if you have to, take more classes, do a post-bac program, whatever you need to do to show admissions committees that you can actually do well in the hard science classes. So a lot of the students I work with, for example, come in with subpar GPAs, and I'll tell them, you're not ready to apply right now. You need to show at least for 2 semesters that you could do well in orgo, you can do well in an anatomy and physiology class, a microbiome class, types of classes that you're going to take in medical school, because the first thing admissions committees are going to look at is, are we concerned that this student is going to fail out of our program? And so you kind of have to get over that initial academic threshold. So whether that's explaining 1 grade or 2 grades, something when something actually happens, or just being like, all right, this is my past. It is what it is. Let's move on from here. And I'm going to take classes. I'm going to fix my study habits, and I'm going to really put the time in to get good grades to show admissions committees that I can do this.
So for anyone who might be financially struggling, I know that there are a lot of medical schools that are going tuition free, or they offer, tuition free options. So do you know anything about that you could talk to us about, and would you recommend applying to those?
I definitely recommend applying, but there's really not that many yet, and they're very, very competitive. So I wouldn't put all your eggs in that basket, if I'm just being honest. It's great, but unfortunately, I mean, if you're financially struggling, like there is financial aid at some schools, and then the other thing is taking out student loans. Like that is the harsh reality of this profession. A lot of medical students will be in about $180,000 to like $200,000 of debt. But if you're smart with money, and I highly recommend you learn basic personal finance at some point, because that's something a lot of people in the medical field think that they're not supposed to know how to do. That's not true. You can learn how to do finance, take a course, teach yourself, watch some YouTube videos, where if you're smart, when you start that attending salary, you're going to be able to pay back those loans. And so sometimes you have to make that investment in yourself upfront, knowing that you're going to pay it back on the back end. And so, yeah, sometimes that's just the harsh reality of this profession right now.
And just for our high school audience right now, I see a lot of them asking about BS/MD programs. Do you know anything about that, or do you have advice for them? Yeah.
If you're going to do a BS/MD program, I really hope you have good shadowing experience already as a high schooler, and you are really certain that you want to be a doctor. So you should be doing a lot of like the pre-med stuff, like maybe potentially in high school where you're getting shadowing, volunteering, whatever it is, because you're kind of like pigeonholing yourself into that. Sometimes it's accelerated, so you're taking a lot of classes, and I think it's a great option if you get accepted. You don't have to worry sometimes about the MCAT and things like that, but it's not always necessary. And what will happen sometimes, and I've seen this, I have students who reach out to me like, I crushed the MCAT because it was required. Like I needed to get over a 508 for this school to guarantee me in, but I crushed it. And now I don't know if I should apply to all of like broadly, but now I have to give up my spot. And so there's like a lot of variables. So I think it's a good option, but if you don't do it, BSMD program, you're totally fine just doing pre-med the normal way. So it's good, look into it, but it's not the end all be all.
Right. Just for just a little side note, I know that there are some BSDO programs too, guys. So if you're like looking into those, I know LECOM, Lake Erie College of Osteopathic Medicine, has a BSDO program. So just, if you guys are like looking into that kind of stuff, just a little side note. But just to kind of wrap it all up, do you have any like final words of advice for students, just overall, for anything?
Yeah, so I would say first, learn how to learn, focusing on your study habits, because that's going to make your life a lot easier if you learn how to do well in classes. Enjoy the process. You can absolutely have fun as a pre-med student. I know firsthand that it's possible. And like, I'm not a genius by any means. I did well at Cornell because I figured out like the systems that worked for me with studying. And I worked really hard when I was working. So when you're in the library, try not to be on Facebook, or I guess now it's TikTok, or whatever it is, and really put in that work so that then you could take a Thursday night off, a Friday off, whatever it is. So you can do both. Enjoy the process. Seek help if you need it. If you want to message me on Instagram, I always respond there. Sometimes it takes me a while, but if you want to message me after this, I'll probably be on my phone for a little bit because I have a feeling there'll be some messages. And yeah, just enjoy the process. It's a hard field, but it's a really rewarding field.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for all this wonderful advice for students. We really appreciate you taking the time out to talk to us and give us insights on our journey. We really appreciate it.
Awesome. I see someone said I messaged you on TikTok. It's easier. TikTok messaging is not good for some reason. So if you message me on Instagram, maybe I'd respond a lot faster.
Mm-hmm. So kind of going into a little bit of our side, guys, we do ask that if you guys are able to donate, please do, because running this program is really expensive with the Zoom call payments and the software for email. So if you guys are able to donate, we do ask that you do that. So this was our last call for Zooming through summer, but don't worry, we are going to be starting back up. It's a little cheesy little name, but it's Call Through Fall. And we will be starting that up the second week of September. And our first speaker will be a facial plastic surgeon, and that will be on the 8th. And we'll be releasing more information and details on that soon. So keep up with that on our Instagram. And as Adam said, if you have any questions about his program, the pre-med consultants, or any questions in general for him, you feel free to DM him. Adam, if you want to put your Instagram.
Oh yeah, I'll put it there.
Sure. Yeah. And then I'll put it on the YouTube as well, so students there can get it. Is it Adam?
It's just, yeah, it's Adam. Oh, sorry, I didn't have it set to everyone.
Underscore Nessim. Okay, perfect. All right.
It's the same on TikTok. So Instagram and TikTok are the same.
All right. Thank you so much again. And I will see you guys all in September. Bye.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Bye.